In 1984, an author from Maryland published a novel that would not only define a brand new genre, but build an entire career and legacy spanning 26 years and counting. Tom Clancy was a major pioneer of the techno thriller genre. In 1996, he co-founded Red Storm Entertainment. The studio would be mostly responsible for adapting Clancy's novels into games, but it would be acquired by Ubisoft in 2000. And in 2008, Tom himself sold the rights to the usage of his name in perpetuity to the same company. In 1998, the studio would release Rainbow Six to tie in directly with Clancy's next book. Its release on August 21st, 1998 would not only mark the start of tactical shooter history, but would also be a major milestone when it came to the modern military shooter genre, since it is the oldest game I can find that draws inspiration from real-world military hardware and operations, as well as being an FPS with a focus on tactics and strategy. Therefore, it's not only the first tactical shooter, but also one of, if not the first, military shooter in FPS history. While Red Storm Entertainment was adapting novels into franchises that spanned generations, the historical setting of World War II was being pushed by Steven Spielberg with the Medal of Honor games. In fact, the Medal of Honor franchise's history starts only a year after Rainbow Six's release. Medal of Honor, being co-published and written by the man who made Saving Private Ryan, meant that they were grounded and gritty while also being significantly more action-oriented, with big set pieces that are driven by heavy scripting. These games directly inspired the Call of Duty franchise, and it's no big surprise. Spielberg clearly brought his Hollywood experience into the medium of video games, which was carried over once Call of Duty began development. Now, in direct contrast to all this, Tom Clancy's games were all very raw experiences. They attempted to portray modern combat without any fancy set pieces. For example, Rainbow Six was entirely driven by the player's planning and execution, and this style of game design was iterated upon not just in later releases from Red Storm, but in future modern-themed shooters. Now, I should say that I genuinely don't believe the onus of the tactical shooter genre lies entirely on the shoulders of Tom Clancy. For example, the developers behind Operation Flashpoint, Bohemia Interactive, would have found success regardless of whether or not Clancy had ever decided to found Red Storm Entertainment. Tom Clancy was simply in the right place at the right time, at least in terms of video game history. Regardless, it is undeniable that the bar for modern military shooters between 1998 and 2007 was set by the folks at Red Storm, Bohemia Interactive, Irrational Games, as well as modders like Minlay and Jess Cliff. But in 2007, something would change the landscape of the shooter genre forever. Something that would cause major shifts in not just the genre, but the gaming industry as a whole. When Call of Duty's fourth entry finally debuted, it changed the landscape forever. Its multiplayer spawned a formula that is consistently used and iterated on to this day, and likely for the foreseeable future as well. Call of Duty has easily become a household name, and its continued success can be attributed directly to Modern Warfare and its sequel. Aside from its glorification of combat and justification of the invasion of Iraq, it's a pretty damn good game. The success of Call of Duty's fourth entry cannot be attributed to lightning in a bottle. The action-adventure formula, derived from the franchise's roots in World War II stories, has been adapted for a modern setting, and people fucking love their World War II stories. Call of Duty 4 had an engaging premise with good pacing. It also utilized a globe-hopping narrative not too dissimilar to the Rainbow Six games. On top of all of this, the accessible Hollywood action film presentation meant it was well received by all demographics. This Call of Duty recipe was one Activision would continue to milk for everything it had. While 2008 through 2019 could be considered a golden age for tactical shooters, I like to think of it as the Iron Age. A huge step forward, yes, but inherently built upon the back of the Bronze Age that was 1998 to 2007. While classics like Arma 3 or Squad released during this period, both of these games had foundations. Arma 3 was a sequel to a long-running, very successful franchise, and Squad was a successor to Project Reality, a modification for Battlefield 2. Even Insurgency and Insurgency Sandstorm would succeed a source mod. A lot of these games we consider classics only existed because they had communities prior to Modern Warfare's release date. This community carried the genre through a period where most funding was going towards action-adventure experiences instead of realistic simulations. This is reflected in franchises like Rainbow Six and Ghost Recon, which were forced to adapt to the new gaming landscape despite being more grounded in prior titles. This period is where I believe the term tactical shooter started seeing more usage. I genuinely cannot track down when the term itself was coined, but in my humble opinion, it was only after the popularization of Call of Duty's Hollywood action formula that the term would create a whole new subgenre. But roughly around 2019 through to today, the genre has entered its renaissance period, in no small part spurred on by the huge success that was Escape from Tarkov. In 2019, a Twitch Drops event caused a massive spike in viewership, causing the game to become relatively mainstream. Ask anyone who plays games if they've heard of Escape from Tarkov, and they'll likely say yes. The prestige gained from the community at large allowed for a massive spike in interest towards extraction shooters and, by proxy, tactical shooters. The extraction gameplay loop was effectively the new battle royale. This meant that new extraction modes for existing games were coming out all the time, and the spotlight put on Tarkov during this period no doubt drew new developers into the genre. On top of all of this, I firmly believe that the kids who grew up playing Rainbow Six, SWAT 4, and Arma are finally old enough and skilled enough to enter the indie scene. That's why we're seeing a sudden spike in indie-led tactical shooters, especially since nowadays game development has never been easier to get into, with many free options for game engines and even open source engines existing. You can just download and start learning in minutes. Well, unless you're me. Now, obviously I understand that tactical shooters would likely never have been mainstream. There was always going to be some other game that came along to shake up the industry, had Call of Duty not capitalized on the market first. But the loss of engaging single-player milsim games or tactical shooters, I feel, can be directly pinned on Call of Duty's success, as a campaign is a very risky thing to build, both in the years after the success of Modern Warfare's multiplayer, and especially now in the age of live service monetization, where it is easier and likely cheaper to build multiplayer-only games. Plus, it gives people an excuse not to make good AI, which is a huge gripe of mine in modern gaming. I don't see the genre seeing a return to full-length campaigns a la Rainbow Six or Ghost Recon. The closest we have nowadays is Ready or Not, but that game has some fatal flaws as well as lacks important mechanics that were present in Rainbow Six and SWAT 4. Okay, I don't know how to segue to the conclusion of this segment, so this is my segue to the conclusion. Although niche, tactical shooters evoke something in me that no other genre has ever been capable of. They can evoke this sense of dread and horror. They give me a true sense of why I'm so afraid and averse to war in the real world. They, to me, feel like an encapsulation of a true anti-war experience.
Well, everybody knows war is hell. Remember, you heard it here last.
War isn't hell. War is war and hell is hell. And of the two, war is a lot worse.
How do you figure that, Hawkeye?
Easy, Father. Tell me, who goes to hell?
Sinners, I believe.
Exactly. There are no innocent bystanders in hell. But war is chock full of them.
This is the part of the video that has been difficult for me to contemplate and even harder to parse into words. In fact, this section is why the video has taken easily almost a year to write. The quote on screen right now is about film, but it could easily be about any media genre. There are a lot of ways to interpret this quote. The idea that any piece of media glorifies war could either be in the way that no artist, no matter how good, can control how people react to their art, therefore meaning that people can always misinterpret what that art is about. It could also be interpreted in that fiction is designed to entertain, so in making something entertaining, you give people consuming your art positive associations with, for example, war and combat. Therefore, no piece of entertainment can truly be anti-war, especially now that we come to the topic of video games, art intended more than any other to entertain. I'm not nearly as educated on this topic as I want to be, so please forgive me, as I am always trying my hardest to keep an open mind and take great care to be respectful of the grave nature of the topic of war, both in fictional media and in the real world, and how the latter affects the former. But my personal perspective on the tactical shooter genre as a whole has always been anti-war. I grew up far and away from war. I'm American. We start on just wars for fun and stick our noses in ones we have very little business in. So I suppose it's in my nature to think I know how to talk about things I very much lack experience in. But I can never claim to know war, nor claim to know its first-hand effects. I'm sitting from a perspective of privilege that has no right to say what is or isn't accurate to real-world armed conflict, nor its effects on the human beings caught in the crossfire. But games like Arma, Squad, Rising Storm, and Insurgency all make me feel to some extent the weight of combat from the perspective of a soldier. When someone gets blown up or shot and dies in some morbid fashion, I might chuckle and go, that's fucked up. But in the moments of silence afterward, the small breaks from the stress and action allow me to put things into context as if it was real. Funnily enough, this simulates the paradoxical nature of being a soldier, at least as I understand it. While the military desensitizes you to the act of killing through training, there are often still lasting traumatic effects. On top of this, soldiers become conditioned to enjoy combat due to the rush of adrenaline from the near-constant fight-or-flight situations they're forced into. Not too dissimilar to how games like Arma or Tarkov get your adrenaline flowing through the high-intensity or high-stakes fights you can get into. Though, unlike real soldiers, once the action settles and the game's closed, there's a significant lack of lingering trauma to process when you get home. That is, if you actually have a home to come back to. Not so fun fact, did you know that veterans make up 7% of the homeless population? And on top of that, have twice the risk of suicide in comparison to civilians? It's pretty fucking depressing that the supposed world's greatest military can't even fucking properly take care of its soldiers. It is in this way that playing any kind of military shooter is effectively a form of voyeurism. Quite literally in the case of body cam style games, of which they are supposed to replicate the feeling of watching combat footage, which admittedly I am guilty of looking at on occasion. While I like the body cam perspective in games, it's purely from a gameplay perspective. As reluctant as I was to play body cam, since it felt like a cash grab in the wake of Unrecord's demo videos, it has some of my favorite weapon and character controls, as accurate shots often require knowing where your barrel is pointed more than relying on crosshairs or sights. I would so much rather see the body cam perspective used in a horror setting. I mean, found footage is literally one of the most popular genres of horror ever, and that befits the concept of a body cam perspective so much more than the uncreative propaganda slop that Unrecord is shaping up to be. Plus, the modern setting of both Unrecord and body cam just furthers this idea of voyeurism, this commodification of suffering. All of this is to say that military shooters inherently feed you the vicarious feeling of combat without the responsibility of causing harm, or the lasting mental and physical effects that come with it. This, I'm sure, is a concept that a lot of folks who play tactical shooters grasp on some level. But this is also an important part of the experience to me. This vicarious experience of the horrors of war, to me personally, is what drives home how much I would never want to be involved in war, nor would I want anyone else to have to go through it. My personal connection with tactical shooters starts all the way back in middle school. Running Ubuntu meant that I had very little in the way of playable games, since Steam's Proton system was very limited, and Wine's support for games kinda sucked. I managed to play New Vegas through one of these programs, though. Anyway, my gateway drug was Insurgency 2. Running on the Source engine meant native support for Linux, so for hours I would either play CSGO or Insurgency, and I was hooked. Throughout high school, I would get way into Rust and Tarkov, and as an undiagnosed ADHD troubled child, the games demanded patience that I simply didn't have. These games forced me to control my impulses and my emotions to properly succeed. I effectively behaviorally trained myself to cope with my issues through video games, and it genuinely helped me graduate high school and properly conduct myself in a professional work environment. So, to make a long story short, this genre means a lot to me, and is a core part of my childhood. Now, as an adult, I find myself engaging with all kinds of genres. I'd be hard-pressed to find a genre that I don't have at least one game I enjoy in. I've especially found myself enjoying turn-based strategy significantly more, and it's made me realize that this is kind of why I love tactical shooters as much as I do. The quick, from-the-hip style of strategy required for survival in games like Tarkov forces me to think quickly under pressure, and I work really well under pressure. All in all, tactical shooters are the perfect genre for me. They push me to my limits in a way that only games like Doom Eternal and Ultra Kill have been able to, although in a slightly different way. So it's clearly no secret that I love this genre, but it's not without its flaws. The biggest, in my opinion, is the lack of creativity that plagues this genre. I love a modern military setting as much as the next guy, but come on. The most variation on the genre comes from regimental warfare games and medieval brawlers, and yes, I will fight you on the validity of the latter subgenre. To top it all off, one of the most interesting camera perspectives in the FPS genre right now is literally used for a propaganda game, by putting in the least amount of creative effort possible. As stated earlier, the body cam perspective would be so much better utilized in a survival horror setting. Hell, I just want to see more tactical shooters branch off into new subgenres anyways. I want more tactical horde shooters, the closest of which I can get is Payday the Heist or SCP-5K, the latter of which is literally one of the only horror-based tactical shooters on the market right now, and it's a massive breath of fresh air. To all the indie devs out there making tactical shooter-inspired games, please play with different settings and themes. This community could seriously use the innovation. Now, while the unique gameplay loop hooked me and keeps me engaged to this day, the tactical shooter genre has a dark passenger in the form of its community. Unfortunately, the setting of modern war often attracts folk who idolize it, or the institutions that cause it, and they bring with them all the political leanings often attached to these ideals. Gamers already hate queer people and racial minorities, and running into that type of person is way more likely when you're in an environment where everyone is LARPing as an army man. So for literally anyone who isn't a straight white man, it's difficult to want to be in these spaces for a good reason in my opinion. Which is why I have been working on my own community space for over a year now, catered towards people who are interested in the genre without the pervasive toxic gamer culture. While I've met some really chill people through these games, media literacy and people into militarist aesthetics don't mix for most people. It was astounding how many people didn't understand the satire of Helldivers 2 on launch, and you still see people missing the messages of Metal Gear. There are so many fandoms that inadvertently attract the worst kinds of people. The best way for me to put it is that the tactical shooter genre is like my home state of Idaho. It's got beautiful landscapes, and the skiing, camping, fishing, and hiking are all incredible. But the people who live there can embody the worst parts of humanity. The worst parts of these spaces are the people that inhabit them. I want to thank all of you for making it this far. I cannot express how much your support means to me, and I cannot put into words how excited I am to finally be starting this video series on a genre that is close to my heart. Starting with this video, I want to look at individual tactical shooters, especially the unique and obscure games, as well as the few story-driven and single-player games in the genre. So please, subscribe and stay tuned for more, because this is an exciting step forward for me and my channel. I'd also like to note that what I said at the end of Chapter 4 holds true. But I also gotta say that I've met a not insignificant number of especially neurodivergent people who have sexual or gender identities that are unconventional for these spaces. This applies to almost all of these spaces. The duality of militarist aesthetics seems to be attracting trans girls or Nazis. Anyways, all of this is to say that trans girls make the best mech pilots, so stay tuned for signups for the FAF mech division for our Arma 3 operations. Love y'all, bye! Oh, and trans rights are human rights.